Years ago, a friend of mine and I visited Shiloh National Military Park, located on the Tennessee River near Savannah, Tennessee. Our visit turned out to be a worship service. I'll get to that later. Now, when I was a boy living in Jackson, Tennessee, middle of the western part of the state, every April I joined hundreds of other people to retrace and remember the two-day battle at Shiloh during the war between the states. You could call it Civil War. It's also called the Battle of Pittsburgh Landing, complete with troop movements and formations across the fields and through the woods. 30 years later, returning to Shiloh brought back fond memories, and my friend who was with me tolerated, barely, my lecture on the importance of the battle, what happened, when, and where. The generals, one of whom, by the way, wrote Ben-Hur, and so forth, far more detailed than anybody should have to endure. For those of you who don't know, Shiloh was the first really big battle of the war between the states. Over 25,000 casualties over the course of only 2 days, which is, now get this, more casualties than the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the Mexican-American War combined, counting both sides of those conflicts. Shiloh signaled that the war between the states would be no short-lived civil skirmish, but that it would be full-blown military war. As we arrived that day, volunteers were firing a cannon near a place called the Sunken Road. And interesting as that was, it paled compared to what happened along that road 165 years previous. The Federals were encamped along the west side of the Tennessee River, and the Confederates, having just marched up from Corinth, Mississippi, snuck up and attacked. The Federals reeled back towards the Tennessee River, losing thousands of troops. But eventually, the Federals mustered along the Sunken Road. And when I say sunken, we're talking sunken to the tune of 6 to 18 inches maximum. That's all the protection that the Federals had as the Confederates attacked with bayonet charges, cannon volley, and withering fire. So thick were the bullets going through the trees that they called it the hornet's nest. The carnage was horrific on both sides. Wounded soldiers of all stripes crawled and hobbled to a pond that by common agreement became neutral territory. And so many wounded waded into the pond that in the space of 3 hours it turned beet red. They called it Bloody Pond. Eventually the Confederates flanked the Federals and captured thousands, but dusk fell and both sides withdrew to measure the costs, the gains, and the losses. During the night, fresh Union troops came down the river from Savannah, and the next day they drove the Confederates back. In military terms, Shiloh was mostly a draw. In human terms, the battle was whatever you want to call it. What do I call it? I agree with the Federal General George Sherman, who offered One of the most profound theological insights in the history of humanity. Sherman said, "War is hell." Shiloh was hell, not like hell, where you go when you die if you believe in that sort of thing, but literally hell on earth. Me, I don't believe that the aforereferenced hell is some geographic place down deep in the earth opposite heaven up yonder in space somewhere. Such religious fantasies as that don't interest me at all. But I'm dead positive that hell exists because I've seen evidence of it at Shiloh, Antietam, Gettysburg, Vicksburg, Lookout Mountain, Bull Run, Sharpsburg. I've seen what the world looks like after hell comes visiting. It looks like thousands of dead people, not Federals, not Confederates, dead people. Hell looks like Bloody Pond. It looks like Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, like a nation wounded, crippled, stripped of its finest young men who could have contributed far more to the quality of their lives and the life of our country than killing each other, being killed and killing. I don't know if I'll ever answer this question to my satisfaction, but I must ask it anyway. Was the war between the states worth it? Was it worth going to hell? On August 6th, 1945, 65 years ago, just this last August, the B-29 bomber Enola Gay dropped a bomb on Hiroshima. And they say that for a split second, a little drop of the sun touched the earth, with predictable results as concerns suns coming to earth. The temperature flashed at 10 million degrees, give or take, and then settled down to a balmy 9,000 degrees. However, succeeding in vaporizing most everything for a quarter square mile and creating a devilish hurricane that killed 150,000 people outright, mostly civilians, and thousands more since that time due to radiation poisoning. A little drop of the sun, a tiny, tiny, infinitesimally small drop of the sun came to earth that day. But I preferred Sherman's description that the Enola Gay visited hell upon Hiroshima that day. And so the question remains, was it worth it? Worth going to hell? Was it worth going to hell? Is a question rarely asked these days. Most people think that the notion of hell is arcane. And with respect to Shiloh and Hiroshima, more appropriate and sophisticated questions address the horrors of war, such as, did the battles hasten the end of the war? Did the war between the states keep the United States united? Did it end slavery? Did the South and the Japanese have whatever was coming to them because they started it? Did the two battles save lives in the long run? And you know what? Those are important questions, but because they don't get asked often enough, hell visits earth on a fairly regular basis. Lord knows We know something about that. The United States has been at war, in some kind of war, for 225 of 242 years of its existence. 17 years of our existence as a nation, we haven't been at war. Let's remember other times that hell visited earth since Hiroshima. Bosnia, Vietnam, Stalin, Chairman Mao, lynchings all across the Jim Crow South, Japanese war crimes, the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, Lieutenant Oliver North and the Iran-Contra mass killings, Auschwitz, the Khmer Rouge genocide. But the simpler question, was it worth going to hell, rarely gets asked because humanity has adapted so well to hell that we accept hell as a given. Why? One explanation might be human beings have a proclivity for understanding each other primarily because, according to their differences, more than what's common to all of us. Think about it. North, south, black, white, male, female, Yankee, rebel, Japanese, Allied, Axis, Allied, North Vietnamese, South Vietnamese, and so forth. Differences, not what's common. In and of itself, distinguishing things one from the other is essential to human cognition and intelligence, but so is discerning commonalities. And when distinction takes priority over patterning, the psyche reverts to its lizard nature. I think that hell is simply when failing to orient our unique differences with our commonalities. When that happens, it goes viral. And what's this got to do with us as people of faith? Viewing other people only as others, and only ourselves as us. Doing that denies God's blessing on all humanity. And that is a terrible thing to do, something for which we and we alone are responsible. God does not impose hell on earth. God did not invent hell. We do it ourselves just fine. Ought we to have fought Shiloh? Ought Hiroshima to have been bombed? Or Nagasaki? Or London? Or Warsaw? Or Hanoi? Or Dresden? Or the World Trade Center? Again, those are important questions, but they're secondary questions. The first question follows Hamlet's lead, to be or not to be. All of us. That is the question, and until we answer that one question positively, and until we commit ourselves to its demands, we, all of us, shall not be. We shall simply exist and endure Shiloh's bayonets and Hiroshima's tiny, tiny drops of the sun. As we left Shiloh that day, my friend mused, "This place must cost a fortune to maintain and staff," to which I asked, "Is it worth spending your tax dollars on battlefields and such?" But he answered the question, absolutely. The United States is fortunate not to have endured on its own lands many wars, so it's awfully easy to forget what war really is. Maybe if more people visited Shiloh, we wouldn't feel so casual about hell. We made one final stop during our visit to Shiloh. We went to one of the cemeteries, wandering among the gravestones. How does that poem go? "In Flanders fields the poppies grow, between the crosses row on row." We said nothing. We watched the sway of the giant oak trees that once shaded the wounded when hell came to earth at Shiloh. In the distance, we saw monuments to the armies of Ohio, Pennsylvania, Alabama, and Tennessee. We saw the places where generals fell. We saw the places where guns pivoted to blast holes into God's precious sons, where 50 caliber rifle balls tore life from limb. And then, there at Shiloh, do you know what else we saw? We saw the charred shell of the dome in Hiroshima, and we saw the great battleships upturned at Pearl Harbor. And we saw the prisoners on the Bataan Death March. We saw Agent Orange and Little Bighorn and Trafalgar and Moscow. We saw Normandy. We saw Iwo Jima. We saw Dresden. We saw the sacking of Rome. And we saw racism and sexism and ageism and every monument to hell on earth. Oh yes, there at Shiloh, we saw them. And then we left. We didn't talk much. We didn't have much to say. God accompanied us on our journey to hell's memory that day, and that's why I think that it was a worship service. You could say that if you wanted to.
For the fruit of all creation, thanks be to God. For God's gifts to every nation, thanks be to God. For the plowing, sowing, reaping, silent growth while we are sleeping, future needs in earth's safekeeping, thanks be to God. In the just reward of labor, God's will is done. tempests of the Spirit, thanks be to God. For the good we all inherit, thanks be to God. For the wonders that astound us, for the truths that still confound us, most of all that love has found us, thanks be to God.
Let us pray. O God, we remember those who go to war in our name, giving thanks for courage, for love of country, for those who work to bring about peace in the world. Remind us, O God, that the goal of any war must be justice and peace. And today we pause to give thanks to God for veterans who serve the world's need for peace. We seek to bind up the wounds of those who serve. Enable us to know how to comfort, how to bind up their wounds, and enable them to know how to heal themselves, their bodies, their minds, their hearts. Remind us that the widow, the orphan, the widower, and the veteran all know the cost of war. And in being reminded, challenge us to love the warrior, but hate the cost of war. We pray for a time when peace will reign and become plowshares once more, that war be known only in history books and our memories. Thus we give thanks that you remain with us as we celebrate the service of all who dared to go forth in our name as peacemakers. Remind us that such service is not a movie, an adventure, not something to be glorified. Remind us that war is a failure by all of us to overcome hatred with love, injustice with righteousness, violence with peace. And we give thanks for those who strive to protect us from such failures by peacefully, strongly, boldly speaking truth to power, by resisting hate, by fostering heaven on earth. May those people be us. May we truly be your people as makers of peace. Amen.